Hi, my name is Naki Osute. I'm Associate Vice President for Social Impact Canada at TD Bank Group. On behalf of TD, I'd like to thank you for being here today. This February is not just another African Heritage Month. We are gathering at a time where Black communities and their allies around the globe are demanding we confront the ongoing realities of anti-Black racism in every aspect of society. We must continue to push progress forward. When we launched the TD Ready commitment in 2018, our goal was to support the conditions necessary for a more equitable tomorrow. Now, 3 years later, that commitment has put us on a path to help address inequities across social, economic, and environmental spheres. We continue to seek out better ways to support the Black customers, colleagues, and communities we serve today and into the future. Over the last year, we've invested more time than ever before in dialogue with community and industry leaders from Black-led, Black-owned, and Black-serving organizations, while centering the voices of Black TD colleagues. And we're embedding these lessons learned into our institution, driving change and creating a better bank as we move forward. So on behalf of TD, I thank you for supporting our collective learning journey with your presence here today.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis. I'm here today with special guests to discuss healing, collective healing and wellness in the African Nova Scotian communities. The last episode, we talked about grief and loss and the impacts of that, the complexities of that within the African Nova Scotian communities. So here today, I have special guests with me, Rajean Williams, Matthew Thomas, and Rashida Simons. And we're going to get into a dialogue around collective healing and wellness. So I'll just introduce you all a little bit. Rajean Williams, born and raised in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. She's the general management at Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia for the past 7 years. She is dedicated to continuing the protection, promotion, and perseverance of African Nova Scotian culture and history. She's very much in tune with her own wellness and has been on a healing journey for some time now. Matthew is from the beautiful community of East Preston. He has served in pastoral ministry for 9 years. He currently oversees multi-ethnic and multi-site ministry at Deepwater Church in Halifax. He has a heart for church planting and the ministry of reconciliation, especially across racial lines. He also is passionate about social justice issues and believes the church ought to have a prophetic voice in the face of injustice affecting our city and world. And Rashida is an African Canadian and an Indigenous woman from Nova Scotia. She is an educator, a writer, healer, and counselor. She is fully dedicated to enriching lives through therapeutic interaction, youth advocacy, mentoring, skill building, and working toward healing within the historic Black Nova Scotian community in various ways through promoting self-awareness and ancestral spirituality. So welcome all of you to Our Stories, Our Experiences.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rajean.
Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about, in your opinions, what does the concept of healing and wellness mean to you? Rajean, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, well, it's kind of broad.
Yeah.
And, my personal experience with healing only started a few years ago. And so for me, I would say healing and wellness is a lot of ups and downs. It's about maybe feeling safe, but also maybe being scared in those moments, about trusting yourself, but knowing that you might have to start over again. Yeah. And then also it's a lifelong journey. Like healing doesn't just happen and then you're done, because there's a lot that we all go through every single day, whether that be past or present traumas, where healing needs to come into effect. And so for me, healing has definitely been a roller coaster, but it's gotten me to a place where I feel like I can give that unconditional love that I've given myself to others in a very positive way, in a very helpful way.
I love that.
Yeah.
Often we do give out that love to other people externally, but that internal work takes a lot more time and effort and, real thought, in how we can fulfill that inner piece of us.
Yeah. And you have to trust yourself. I feel like healing has brought me to a place of trusting who I am at my core and not being afraid of that, and trusting that my experiences don't define me.
Yes.
Right. And so moving forward with that, right? Like not victimizing myself in any way, maybe going through a moment of that, but then understanding those moments are not going to define who Riel is in any sense, or who people are going to see me as. And so, yeah, it's brought me to that mindset, I guess, mindfulness.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you, Riel.
No problem.
How about you, Matthew?
Yeah, I would say, Rajean, wellness to me, starting there, would be the idea of wholeness. And so mind, body, spirit, your emotions, all having cohesion and congruence and flowing as they should. And also part of wellness to me is nothing missing, nothing broken. So relationally, having a sense of health in your relationships, and so wellness being reflected in all of your being, and to kind of experience that and fulfill that, healing comes into me where those things in life that aren't well or are broken or are not right, healing is the process by which they're made right. And so that's how I would define wellness and healing as it's a process, but it's really about there's this Hebrew word called shalom, which really captures this idea of wellness to me, where it's, again, nothing missing, nothing broken. It's holistic, about the whole experience of a human. And also, again, part of that process is when we live in a broken world where we have challenges, we have hurts, we have hang-ups, we have habits. I have them, we all have them. And so healing is that process that helps restore and reconcile and help us get back to that place of shalom, of healing, of wellness.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, nothing missing, nothing broken.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you. Rashida, how about you?
I think healing is kind of two things mixed. So when we say healing, a lot of times we're looking for like where the wounds are and where the dark places are, where the shadows are. And that's important to identify those things so that we can, investigate how to heal them, what their origins are, right? But also, I think a lot of healing can be identifying strengths. So sometimes there's things in ourselves that we don't see. So being able to identify areas that we are well and are strong is part of healing as well. And wellness, I think, is just maintaining the balance between, those things. So when Matthew mentioned being unwell, to me, it just also translates to like a misalignment. So how do I get it back even, so I feel stable?
Yeah. I love all of your thoughts on healing, wellness, the cohesiveness of all of it together. And I like what you're saying too about, identifying our strengths and being able to identify those parts of us that we can nurture really and continue to build upon, while also acknowledging the areas that maybe we need to do a little bit more work on, but we can bring that into the conversation as well. So this is all bringing to me this idea of, intergenerational healing. And we talked about intergenerational grief and loss a bit in the sense of how we learn to cope with grief, loss as African Nova Scotian people. But also, I think our healing practices are kind of intergenerational in some sense too, or the ways that we practice wellness. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think intergenerationally, I think we haven't had a lot of safe and healthy spaces to really explore. I would say part of that intergenerational reality is trauma that becomes normalized as normal behavior, and therefore even understanding what is health, what is things off balance, because when you're in a survival space, experiencing human flourishing, we may not even have an appetite or sensitivity to that, because we had to endure so much coming to this part of the world, coming through the systemic issue of slavery, and inheriting some of that trauma and that subjugation and the consequence and ripples of that legacy. And I think, and also having to endure still systemic issues today and racism today, and which kind of piles on and reactivates that trauma that I think it is passed down generationally. I know I inherit some of what my dad experienced in his life, and so I think for me, your first segment about grief and loss, I think that's a great starting place for healing and restoration is recognizing what has been lost, not just when loved ones are gone, but any type of loss, even experience with discrimination. That's the sense of loss of your dignity and your worth.
That's right.
And so it's really just, for me, healing becomes self-awareness and acknowledging those things and being, I use this dynamic, it's willing to be honest and at the same time honoring those who you're in relationship, ancestors, those who come before you. But I think sometimes in our community, because we live in an honor-shame dynamic, there's a lot of honor, but there's not always a lot of honesty of how we can actually, because you can never heal what you don't reveal.
That's right.
And so if there's not an honesty to have the conversation, to dialogue about things that are often elephants in the room, but no one wants to talk about, I'm sure we all have family secrets or things that the family might be ashamed about that I think gets perpetuated generationally, unfortunately.
What happens in this house stays in this
There you
house.
go. And again, I do, there's the honor in that. I agree with it, but I think to have health and healing, there has to be the honest conversation about unpacking some of the things that we have internalized to survive, but need to really unpack and deal with to flourish.
Yeah, for sure. Rashida?
Well, when I think about my family in particular and intergenerationally, like for example, on my mom's side, a lot of the healing centered around self-care. So especially with the women. So it would be like, okay, doing your hair, making sure that you're well dressed, having a clean house, just taking care of yourself was a way that they brought healing into their lives. On my dad's side, like he was an athlete, so it was more about physical activity, but also he had a saying, carry the book, carry the ball. So he would incorporate physical activity with mental activity as well, like reading, gaining information and knowledge and wisdom. So those are some things that I believe were passed down to them from, their elders. And one thing I will say with that is a lot of verbal expression of healing was kind of missing intergenerationally. Like you said, what stays in the house, what's said in the house stays in the house, which I agree with because privacy is important. But I mean, even amongst the family members to speak about feelings, to speak about wounds, even old wounds. Like I basically have a sister circle amongst my cousins and we talk about things that happened to our grandmother, our grandfathers, back in the greats, stories we've heard, right? And how we try to not perpetuate and repeat some of the things that were negative traumas, but then also take the things that they taught us that are, wise and beneficial. So I think talking about those things, like a lot of those things are really hush-hush, but talking about it helps us to understand, like, okay, well, maybe that's why, grandma was like this because these things happened to her.
Right.
Whether it be from the outside world with racism or in the home.
Yeah.
So even, for example, my grandmother had stillborn twins. And that's something that was like probably super traumatic, especially at that time. And, it's like, how did she mourn? How did she deal with that? So being able to talk about it with my aunts and my mom, it gives me a better understanding of that kind of thing. So.
And there's this empathy, I think, that we have for our greats. And when we're trying to understand, how did they process something? How did they deal with something? And recognizing also that they probably didn't in many ways, right? Or at least what they had at that time likely didn't suffice, that healing part of their story that they needed.
Right.
So yeah, it's really sad to think about that. Riel, do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think, depending on where your story starts with your healing journey, whether you had to hit rock bottom or, relationship ended, or you did something out of character for yourself that brought you to a place of, this isn't me, why is this happening, right? I feel like, me personally, my experiences, there was no real understanding of what does healing even start and look like? Like, where do you go for that? We have these images of, oh, I have to go to therapy, right? And who can afford that?
True.
Not anyone in my family or in the communities that I grew up in, right? And so automatically there's a barrier there. And then if you're not receiving, you know, and as Rashida said, it kind of clicked for me, you know, like my dad being an athlete and some of the things that he instilled in me, and my mother with self-care. It's like, I didn't even realize those things were happening. So it kind of, I had a leg up, I guess, of like wanting to start the healing journey. But there's a lot of people who don't even have that support, right, in the home. So then where do you go if you can also access what may be able to help you in the outside world? So that's something that I look at when I think about other people around me who are struggling. Like, how do we help folks get even a foot in the door of what does healing look like for me?
Yeah. And I think you bring a good point up. Often we don't acknowledge even that we require that, or that our wellness really is holistic or whole, as you said, Matthew, and that we have to, you know, be aligned and balanced in order to really thrive and reach our fullest potential. And so the first step is really to understand when that has to happen, you know, or if it's not happening.
And one thing that's unique as African Nova Scotians is we live it in our Western society is very individualistic. But we are very much a collective people. So part of wellness healing is both the individual kind of journey, because I do think individually you do need to be self-aware, but also there's this accountability, responsibility to the village that you carry. It's a burden that we all carry, and so that can be a weighing on you emotionally. That there's also certain expectation with that. There's also certain just dynamics, and it's both a privilege but also a responsibility to be a part of a collective, to be accountable to the village. That also, I think, is an interesting dynamic, especially when you exist in a Western context that is very much individualistic, but you still carry that tension of both being an individual but also being accountable and a part of a broader village. That I think is very much an important factor in what wellness and how we heal as a collective, especially in the African Nova Scotian community.
And for our own individual, how do we, you know, navigate this individualistic world as a collective person or a being, right? And how does that impact our wellness, our own wellness too, in addition to the collective? So we're going to take a break, but after the break, we'll talk more about collective wellness and healing, and also a little bit more in terms of our practices, which, you know, we might have practiced for years and years intergenerationally, and maybe some of the new things that were also practiced back then, but we're just learning more about now and giving ourselves permission to learn about other things. So stay tuned.
We are Afro Nova Jewelry and Accessories. We are located in southwestern Nova Scotia, but we ship our products all over the country. Please take the time to visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/AfroNovaJewelry.
Welcome back to Our Story, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis, and my guests today, Rashida, Matthew, and Riel. We're talking about collective wellness and healing practices within the African Nova Scotian community from our own perspectives. So before the break, we talked about what do the concepts of healing and wellness mean to us. And now we'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as what we do as actual healing and, you know, wellness practices. So Matthew, I wanted to ask you a question because you just left us off talking about this collective healing. And as a pastor, I'm sure that's something that you think about and put lots of energy into when it comes to, you know, being the shepherd, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the role spirituality plays, and has this changed over time when we think about this concept of healing specifically? within the community?
Yeah, well, I know traditionally, historically, sorry, that threw me right off. Can we run that back?
Is that on silent? Okay, where should I pick up? From the top?
Yeah,
Sorry,
Okay.
I got distracted.
It'll be a cleaner edit.
Okay. So welcome back. Thank you all for joining us again on Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis. Today with my guests, Rashida, Matthew, and Riel, we're talking about collective healing and wellness within the African Nova Scotian community. Before the break, we talked about what those concepts mean to us as individuals, but also, witnessing our African Nova Scotian community members as a collective. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those collective ideas and practices when it comes to wellness and healing in our communities. So Matthew, you talked about that collectivity before the break. You talked about how we often carry the weight for ourselves, but also our communities, and how that is a responsibility that we hold. So as a pastor, I'm sure you put a lot of energy into how to articulate that to your congregation, to those around you. Just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, and has spirituality, the role of that in our community, has that changed over time?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question, Regine. I would say that historically, traditionally, the church, and specifically the Black church in Nova Scotia, has played an essential role to both the formation of spirituality and also being a space, that being the spiritual community, to be a place of healing, to be a place of encouragement, to be a place of developing perseverance, especially in going out into a world that doesn't necessarily value your contributions, and trying to be equal with those who you coexist with in society. And so the church has always kind of been that epicenter, not only just spiritually, but also historically, socially as well. It's kind of been that central place. And also one of the beautiful things about the church, and specifically the Black church, is one of the few institutions, if not the only one, that Black people have a level of autonomy over.
Very
and can
true.
actually determine what best serves their interests and needs to be well, to be healthy, to heal, and to just determine what God wants to do in that contextualized space. So that's just, I think, good for viewers to know just the historical role that the church has played. For me personally, I think that we need community for healing. God has made us relationally. He said it's not good for people to be alone, as a matter of fact, according to Scripture. And so I think just the church offers a space that just coming together, being able to come to a place where you're often discouraged or hopeless, to hear a message of hope. And one thing that historically African Nova Scotians, I would say even just people in the diaspora who have a Christian belief system, they relate to the story of Jesus as this suffering servant who endured injustice, but also is a symbol of righteousness, and also offers this story of redemption. And I think that hope in that story has been fuel for Black people for generations, and continues to be. That we have this hope that what we see, or what we endure, or the persecution, or what we suffer is not the only reality. That actually, when we see ourselves as in the context of church, we can see ourselves as full humans, as the image bearers of God, and having our dignity restored. That's one of the biggest things that I think the church offers, and spirituality offers, is dignity. Where you go into a world where there's many contexts and situations where you feel undignified, but you can actually see that the Creator values you, and that you have an equality before Him. I think just that truth and that foundation becomes a safe place to begin dealing with the struggles of life, and the nuances of life, and the realities of living in a world where there's challenges. And so for me, I think the church has always been that space. Also, it offers practices of how you can cope, like meditation, and practicing silence, and prayer, which I think is a huge spiritual discipline that you learn, that enables you to connect with God, but also having healthy outlets to talk about stress and talk about whatever's going on in your heart. What has changed, though, I would say, is not just only in the African Nova Scotian community, but I think spirituality has evolved or has broadened. And what I mean by that is we live in a post-Christian world where our culture, our society is more secular, it's more pluralistic. There's other worldviews that exist that espouse different belief systems. And so I think as a result of that, just broadly, not just specifically in the African Nova Scotia community, but specifically within the African Nova Scotia community as well, particularly around the younger generation, they don't necessarily see the same relevance and the same impact that the church once had for their generation. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, you don't see a lot of young people that are engaged and are able to benefit from that spiritual community. But also, I would own this and take responsibility for this, that as the church, we haven't always given new language or evolving the practices of the church in terms of creating spaces of exploring spirituality or being a space to deal with more contemporary issues. The church has sometimes not did the best job of being a space that has evolved to create that for young people. And therefore, sometimes young people struggle to find a place of healing and of just ownership in a sense of where they really feel like they belong and they have full agency in this community where, again, not to knock the older generation, but they have more of the monopoly on what happens in terms of how that spirituality is formed and shaped and what it looks like.
And I think that religion versus spirituality, or not versus, should I say, but I think there's a difference, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
And we sometimes don't really showcase that difference. We blend the two, and then it becomes, very convoluted and very condemning in a lot of ways, and it just doesn't work.
No.
How about you, Rashida? I know that you're a very spiritual person, and you've been very open and vocal about other ways than just the church to engage in a healing journey. What do you want to say about some of those things?
Well, just to speak to a little bit of what Matthew said, I definitely agree. We are a collective. Right now, I see a lot of people joining together to talk about spirituality as far as how they can find divinity in themselves, like trying to explore their own spirits. So it's not necessarily, it's a focus on the creator, but it's also a focus on how the energy of the creator, the source of all this energy, how does that relate to me? So what in me is a part of that? So what can I find out about my spirit? What gives me that spark? What are things that can make it afraid or empowered, right? And sometimes those are things that, it takes a lot of inner work. It takes a lot, like Matthew said, meditation, quiet time, but also discussion with others. So, when I talk to people about spirituality, their experiences cause me to reflect. Also, I believe that in terms of spirituality, there's, in our community, African Nova Scotian community, there's also this idea that we're, kind of surrounded by our ancestors. And I've heard this my whole life, even though, I grew up in the church as well as my family. They're pretty much all Baptists. There was always this thing like, your grandmother's around you. Like if I'm going through something hard, or like my dad passed when I was young, and my mom would say, your father will be around you and there for you, even in the spirit world. Right. So I think there's a growing consciousness around that as well. And even within that is kind of where we bring spirituality into the physical. Because when you think about ancestors, just like we talked about generational trauma, that can be passed through the blood. We can actually have, like on the physical level, different reactions to being abused. If you come from that generation after generation, it can actually affect your DNA.
Right. Yeah.
In addition to that, good things as well. If like, for example, you can like inherit athleticism, as we spoke about. You can inherit a great singing voice. You can inherit certain temperaments, whether that be, you know, a peaceful one or a not so peaceful one. Artistic ability, like all those things. So when I think about ancestors, these are people who are actually connected to my bloodline. So for me, like if say I'm going through something difficult, I will say something like, you know, to all the warriors in my bloodline, like, I need you here now, those kind of things. Like if I want to call on the mothers, if I need nurturing energy, like I know that it's not only in the spiritual world, it's connected to my blood. Right. So I think that's something it's a rising consciousness around that. Whereas I think in the past, people may have been kind of scared to say something like that because it may be looked at as too far away from traditional religion. And people didn't want to be seen as pagan or other names you may call that. Right. But now I think people feel a little more free to explore. And for me personally, to go back to this, like to focus on how can I find divinity in myself? So what has the Creator put in me? What part of me is connected and aligned with that? And how can I find out more about it? So when I deal with my own spirituality, that's what I like to focus on. And I think also how the mind is connected to the spirit. So how do my thoughts, like the way I think about things, the way I'm processing things, how does that affect my spirituality, my belief systems? So when I think of spirituality, I try to connect all those pieces and make it into, you know.
You aligned them.
Right.
And I think
something joint.
And I think that we often don't really explore the language piece. So how do we frame these things because it all sounds similar when you think about how all the pieces connect, right? There's this piece, that piece to this, but it's also here. So it's like understanding how everything works together. And being able to articulate that so it doesn't come across as this is the way and the only way, and that way can't be because it's not this way, when there's so many, factors that play similar roles in the process.
Well, a lot of that is in religion too, because, when I was little and in church and people were going to get baptized, there used to be a process where you had to go meditate and sit on your own, and you were expected to see a vision.
In the woods.
Right. Yeah. Like you could sit with nature, like you were expected to see something and feel something inside. Exactly. Now, I don't know if that still happens. No, but I know with African Nova Scotians, like, yes, we're traditionally Baptist, but there are some spiritual things we incorporate that are just unique to our culture and community that aren't necessarily pulled from that religion that we've kind of blended.
It had to come from the motherland.
Right.
Historically, that's one thing, if you trace early African Christianity, one of the reasons why a lot of Africans on the continent, this is before slavery, embraced the Catholic tradition, because Catholics have relics and like Marys and they deify people. And they've seen a parallel with that in the ancestors. And so many times instead of worshiping Mary, they're worshiping like in this code way to kind of appease the dominant group who's bringing this Christianity in, to kind of appease what they think is orthodox, but also to honor part of who they are in their culture. With specifically around ancestors. And so there's always going to be a blending that happens, and I think anything that is true should be contextualized, and should that's always been my understanding of God, is he works within a context and with those people. And there's sometimes religion gets sideways when there's hills that we die on that we shouldn't, and as a consequence it actually creates a lack of wellness and division and divisiveness. And really sometimes I think I get the motivation. I think people want to maintain a certain level of what's true, but I think at the same time it can become counterproductive and actually create divisiveness instead of unity, or a sense of, again, that word of shalom that I keep coming back to.
For sure. So Riel, I'll ask you, what role do we as Black people play in our own healing and wellness? So individually, collectively, within our families, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I feel like when you get to a certain level of understanding where you are in your healing, then you're able to share that with others. Obviously, if you don't even know that you have any problems or need to heal or any traumas that affect you, a lot of people, oh, this is just the way that I am.
Right.
This is just who I am, right? But who you are may be hurting others and yourself. But because you can't confront what is really happening, like you haven't made it there. So for me, that's what happened. Like I had to confront that, and I had to get to a level of being in a place where, okay, now I can join the collective. Now I can be in a space where my issues and traumas aren't going to bring anything negative to this collective, right? Because just the lack of knowledge, like I talked about earlier, like how do we get to that point of understanding that you even need to be healed?
Right.
Right.
So you must do that inside work on yourself first.
Yes, 100%. That's, I for me personally, I started off as an individual. Like I said, it could have been a moment that sparked needing to reach out, right? And then as I continued on, I learned that I actually need other people, right? I can only get so far with myself. I've reached out to Rashida, and she's been so helpful in her processes of healing as well. So that sort of allowed me to understand, like, oh, I don't have to be alone in this, even though I do need to do work on myself. I don't have to be alone, because other people's experiences, whether they can relate specifically, are going to be helpful, because everyone's way of healing, like you don't know whether or not someone's way of healing could help you in the end,
right? Or
even just being able to listen to somebody, not to respond and be like, oh, well, this happened to me, oh, that's happening to me, but listen, and maybe someone's story or someone's process can enlighten you in some possible way. But I've always gone back to nature. I've always gone back to some of those old ways of spirituality that I started to discover, and I've gone back to God as well. And I think altogether they're so powerful because it's a collective.
That's right.
Right? Like, and whether or not things cross over one another and people can become confused, I think that when there's an understanding of healing, what process you're going through, you can pick and choose what maybe you need at that time in your specific moment of healing to get to the next level and to continue on.
And isn't there a beauty in that, being able to choose what is going to work for me, right? Not having to, just go with what's there. There's options, and
or thinking you only have one option.
Or thinking you only have one option. And so validation seems as though, self-validation, but from others when you're, sharing your story of healing, or feeling like you need to talk to somebody about what's going on, because I hear us talking about past traumas a lot. And of course, that intergenerational trauma, we talked about racial trauma in this series as well, and acknowledging how those things have been passed down, but also the resilience piece, our strength and survival, which at times, the way we adapt may be a little bit outdated, right? Because it's an intergenerational thing. But being able to recognize that, we have wisdom, we have the power and strength that has come from those before us. And that's what can carry us through, along with other things.
Exactly.
Yeah, as you were saying that, Regine, I think taking ownership of your story is fundamental to the healing journey. Owning it, the good, the bad, the ugly. Understand it, and I think, and part of that ownership is what you described. It's recognizing the rich cultural, historical connections and bloodlines and the stock you come from. I mean, that is many days what will keep you in the fight.
Harnessing that power.
Yeah, exactly. But then at the same time, as an individual, I mean, there's a lot of shame, and that's one thing as a pastor, recognizing it in myself, but also trying to help people through their healing journey. Shame, it can be both reintegrative, meaning, like, again, going back to this honor-shame dynamic. Sometimes shame is good because you want to feel like I did something wrong, because you're accountable to the community, you're accountable to the village, but it's reintegrative. It's ultimately for correction, not to condemn.
Right.
And I think that line is very thin.
Very thin, yeah.
But I think oftentimes that shame is not reintegrative and it's internalized. And people don't want to look at their stories. They don't want to look at what's ugly and what's underneath, not what's ideal, who I want to be. Well, what is just real? What is my trauma? What is my racial trauma? Why am I angry? Why do I have certain behaviors that I'm demonstrating? I think it's owning that, because when you own it, I think you actually take the sting of shame out of it. I think when you're afraid of it, you give power to those things you're embarrassed about. But when you confront them and you name them and you address them and you look right at them, I think you actually take the power of shame out of them and allowing you to own that and really go down that path of your story to the point where, again, it becomes not only restorative to you, but it becomes a testimony to encourage others. And because ultimately I think that collective storytelling has always helped us, but continues to be a strong proponent of healing, that we have to tell our stories of resilience, to tell our stories of overcoming. And I think, but that ownership piece is so key, to own all of who we are and understanding and having that self-awareness, and to not be afraid to say, you know what, I suck, or this sucks, or even just sometimes just things that aren't any fault of your own. Like,
that's a great segue.
Yeah.
And after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about ownership and what role others may play in our healing journeys as well. So stay tuned.
Hey guys, this is Tia from Top Notch Cleaners. If you or someone you may know are looking for a cleaning service or a new cleaning service, look no further. We service all of HRM with regards to commercial, residential, and Airbnb. Our contact is 902-402-9158, and you can reach us Monday to Sunday between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m.
Thanks for joining us back on Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis, and my guests today, Rashida, Matthew, and Riel. We're talking about collective healing and wellness. So before the break, we talked about taking ownership of our own healing journeys, our own stories and experiences, and facing them head on as a way to really get into our healing journey. So I wanted to ask this question: what role do others play in our healing journey? And I'm talking about others that are non-Black individuals. Is there any role that those folks play in the collective healing and wellness of Black folks, in particularly in our province, African Nova Scotian people?
Well, I think something that motivates people these days to investigate spirituality, sometimes outside of their religion, is, like Matthew mentioned, that idea of shame. Because sometimes within an institutionalized religion, it's almost like this feel of, almost like a Puritan feel, where it's like you could be shamed for some things that you're doing. You could be made to feel like insignificant, almost made to feel sometimes that you can't come back from it. And so, like Riel said, when you start to investigate your individual journey, you see that like your path is your own, your journey is your own. A lot of things that happen to people, like the pitfalls, the hard things, the things that other people may just consider them a sinner for, those are actually learning moments that they had to bring themselves back from to make themselves stronger. Sometimes those things are necessary for healing, to show them, you know, how to be better for themselves. A lot of times spirituality can help you understand, you know, why did you make those pitfalls? What did you have to learn from that experience? So it's not just that you're a horrible person. It's like you had to go through that. Through these lessons, you grew so much. And other people may see it as like a permanent stain on your spirit. But you know, you could have come back from some deep, deep darkness. No one may understand that except you. I guess how it connects to, you know, white supremacy, for example, is that a lot of that like Puritan energy does come from a Eurocentric view of religion. And so it was kind of applied to our people. Also, there's a lot of respectability politics that go with it, because we were made to, have to be so perfect for our protection. So you have to, be above board at all times. If you step out of line in any way, you could be hurt, killed, be punished more severely than others. So I think that's another way that people were kept in a box spiritually, because some of that was connected to religion. So, not only are you seen as a bad person, maybe you're seen as a bad Christian, for example. So now that there's some breaking out of that, and people are accepting more their culture, whether that be Indigenous, whether that be African, I think there's more room to realize that a lot of these things are lessons, and they don't necessarily have to be a judgment. Right. So, I think that's how it connects, and kind of breaking out of that mindset, and also identifying where does it come from. So if you can study history and the history of religion, you can kind of see how these things are patterns that have existed for hundreds of years. And once you kind of see that, you can break the hold that it has on your mind and spirit by understanding that these are things that men put in place, humans. So that's why, I consider myself almost like a religious scholar, because I made sure that I, studied religious books and investigated for myself, so I could see, how do the things being said here relate to me and my relationship with God? That's right. And does it resonate? Do I think that's really what God said? How can I decide? So it's the inner work to kind of investigate those things. And for me, it was helpful because I wasn't just taking what someone told me or what the collective believed. I was able to gather the information, go within, and kind of decide what really resonated with my spirit the most, what made me feel the most empowered, what uplifted me the most, and what helped drag me out of those dark places when I needed that strength. So I, amalgamated all those things.
And intuition sounds like
right, absolutely,
a piece of it, right?
Right.
That often, I think, because this Eurocentric worldview system that we live in tells us that you need to be, logic and rational. Right. The emotion, the affect, that intuition stuff comes next, right?
Yeah, because it's a mechanism of control. A lot of times it's used to control people. Right. So it's not only, if you do this, you're bad. Not only are you bad, you're going to hell for the rest of your life. So in some ways, it was a means of societal control. And you can see that by studying history, and not just like Christianity. Religion is used like that throughout history in a lot of different cultures. That's right. So I just made sure that I was mindful of that so I could understand more deeply. Now, I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying you have to be mindful of how it's used and then how that affects you. Yes. And then try to decide what works best for you.
For sure. Riel?
Yeah, so in terms of, having white people in Black spaces of healing. So when I first started my journey, of course, if you're in a crisis, what do? You call the crisis hotline. You are searching for someone to talk to and help. So when I started off, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this, money aside, whatever I need to do. But I found myself in white spaces. I found myself looking at white faces, which is fine. That's part of my heritage. That's part of my people. It's not it was disturbing, but I also didn't find a point of relation. I was just sitting there thinking, well, how will they know what I'm going through? How will this person know what I'm going through? I know they want to help me, but when I start talking about certain traumas that have to do with race, what will they say and how will they relate to me in that way? So I went through a bunch of people, and they, were a part of my healing journey as well. Each time I got to sit down and talk to someone, it did open up different doors, maybe some wounds that I was able to then look at. But essentially, I found myself just going through person after person, kind of feeling like there was something that was going to be left out. Finally, I found someone, and she was a white woman, but her world was revolved around us Black people as community, because she is a part of the Black community by her husband and children, right? So in that sense, maybe because her same name is my mother's and my mother is a white woman, I felt like she could relate to me and understand me in that way.
Yeah.
But it was very much so a struggle to feel like I was going to be able to be helped instead of maybe being formed and molded. And I think that does come from the historical religious aspects of, how white people 100% made Black people live a certain way.
Yeah.
And religion was put into that. So generational trauma is a thing. The way that we think about religion and spirituality is very much connected in that. I'm not saying that, these people don't have a space, because everyone has an opportunity to heal. But when it comes to like dictating how people feel, I guess that's where I'm kind of, unsure of how effective that can possibly be, just because our experiences are so different. Our generational trauma is deep, and we still live in a world where our everyday lives are affected by white supremacy, and so and systemic racism. So I feel like it's difficult to be in the world of therapy and healing in that sense when it's very much so sort of taken over by and lived in by a certain race specifically. I am very excited and happy to know that we do have groups, with the Health Association of African Canadians. They have lists of people of color who can help you, right, in various forms of therapy and healing. So I'm happy that now today we can do that. It might not have been a couple of years ago, but at least we know those resources are up and coming. So we can have those spaces for ourselves.
That's right. And that's a part of the journey, right?
It is.
Is when things come about that maybe we didn't have then, but now we have now, and to share about those, right? And to share our experiences that maybe weren't so pleasant, like you just, shared about different therapists that weren't necessarily understanding you in the way that you needed to. And if we think about that acknowledgement of our past traumas, and that being the first step to healing, or that acknowledgement that we actually need the healing, then how can one help us, guide us through that if they're unaware also? So I think therapy is a piece of the healing. And I think, historically in our communities, we haven't so much looked into that, A, cost, B, who's out there that can understand us 100%. In a culturally responsive way, and also just this taboo or fear around that, and uncovering, those pieces of our stories that we don't necessarily want to face. Matthew, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I remember recently I was watching a video about an Indigenous community, and in this group of Native Americans, they were both Indigenous and Christian. And again, that's one of the things when you look historically sometimes of the misuse of Christianity for the purpose of state empire building, which Christianity became a tool for that historically, and it has affect African Nova Scotians, people of the African diaspora, but also Indigenous people. But despite that, this Native American lady, she's a believer. She believes in her faith in Jesus. And she says something really profound that I think speaks to this, how that tension can work in terms of, how does Black people need to, I think, oversee and have autonomy over their spaces of healing, but also how, what responsibility, if any, do the majority culture have? And she said, what was done in the name of Jesus needs to be undone in the name of Jesus. And I think that's a question that I think, again, going in my context of the church, that we should all ask when you look at those historical just stains of faith, but also affirming the belief that there's still a purity and a power of having faith, particularly in a Christian context, in Christ and the church. When it comes specifically to Black people in terms of healing, I'm a big proponent of self-actualization. So I think Black people have all they need for their collective healing. And going back to use that word ownership, we should take full ownership and don't need anybody else. We don't need anybody else. So I think we have that posture, but also we're generous people. We're communal people. We like to have fun. And I think by our invitation, we invite people into that space who can be allies and who can come alongside and who can be supportive, because I do think there is a role. I can say for the majority of cultures is to have an assumption of empathy and not scrutiny or skepticism about our experience in this world. Be empathetic and try to understand. And then also just don't get in the way.
Right.
Don't make it hard. Don't push the goalpost. Don't try to control or feel like there needs to be, we need that oversight to be able to determine, discover, and realize what our collective healing needs to be. I think that's where I see some of how those dynamics, because again, we still exist in a community together.
That's right.
We're not an island to ourselves. And not only that, we as African Nova Scotians have something to contribute meaningfully to the broader community. And so, but we have to determine and have autonomy to dictate what that looks like, and having other community groups or people groups come alongside that or get behind that, but not try to control it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for joining me for this real courageous conversation.
Yeah.
We uncovered and unpacked a lot, and I hope that folks feel empowered, by listening to us speak today, to embark on their own wellness healing journey in whatever way that looks, and to reach out to folks that you see leading that journey as well, because we all have a piece and a part in it. And I think that we all have a responsibility to own our stories, to own our experiences. So thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you.
On the next episode, we will look at community development, community economics, and how African Nova Scotian people really do have what they need to prosper. So we'll delve into that on the next episode. This is Our Stories, Our Experiences, a talk show series with me, Rajean Willis, and we'll see you next time.